The sun over the Mojave Desert was an unforgiving hammer, and Eleanor Vance had come to receive its final blow. She felt nothing but the weight of each step sinking into the cracked earth. The searing heat on her parched skin was a distant fact, a trivial discomfort compared to the silent storm raging within. The grief inside her was its own sun, a star of pure agony that had burned everything else away, leaving only a desolate void dot. She had chosen this place, the edge of the world, with purpose. Far from town, far from the pitying whispers, and far from the suffocating silence of a home where the ghost of a cradle still haunted every room. The desert would be her tomb, an unmarked grave under a vast sky. It was a fitting end, but then a sound tore through the veil of stillness she sought not. It was a sound that had no business being there, a thin, desperate wail that the hot wind should have swallowed whole. Eleanor stopped, her heavy head lifting. 20 yards ahead, huddled in the meager shade of a dying saguaro cactus, was something. A bundle of coarse linen. The cry grew more urgent as she approached, and a long-forgotten pulse hammered in her chest, a rhythm she thought had been silenced forever. She knelt, her trembling hands pulling back the cloth. Inside was a child, only weeks old. A girl, her skin flushed with fever and her lips as cracked as the desert floor. The baby's eyes were sealed shut, but its small chest still rose and fell in a fragile rhythm. It was alive. Barely, but alive. When Eleanor lifted the child, its weight was negligible, but its warmth was an anchor, holding her to the present. A jolt, sharp and unwelcome, shot through her numbness. It was the sting of life. Someone had left this child here to die, just as she had come for the same purpose, but holding this fragile life. An instinct she thought she had buried with her son surged to the surface. The baby needed water. It needed a defender. It needed someone to fight for it. Eleanor scanned the wasteland. There was nothing. She had come with nothing, no water, no food, no hope. She had planned to lie down and let the sun take her. But now, with the weight of an unspoken promise in her arms, everything had changed. She could gently lay the baby down and continue with her plan. Or she could turn around, face the endless road she had just walked, and try to save them both. Baby's breathing grew shallower. Time was running out. As Eleanor looked at the tiny face, she realized a bitter and miraculous truth. A stranger's desperate decision had just saved her life, but their fight had only just begun. They were not yet safe, not even close. The journey back was a pilgrimage in reverse. Every cactus, every boulder she had passed on her way to oblivion now mocked her with its silence. The sun had climbed to its zenith, a malevolent eye in a bleached white sky, turning the air into shimmering waves. Her own pain was a distant drumbeat, secondary to the fragile pulse she protected. The infant in her arms had fallen into a dreadful silence. Not the peace of sleep, but the stillness of a flame guttering low. That quiet terrified Eleanor more than the screams had. She tried to use the shadow of her own body to shield the small face, but it was a futile gesture against the invisible enemy of the heat. A coppery taste filled her mouth where her lips had split, and thirst was a claw scraping at the back of her throat. It was then that she heard it. Not thunder, but a low tremor, rhythmic and menacing. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving at a gallop. Surge of desperate hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her exhaustion. Salvation, water, help, a chance for this child. She turned, squinting toward the shimmering horizon. 3 figures resolved out of the heat haze, but as the figures grew clearer, the hope in her veins curdled into ice. They did not ride like rescuers. They rode with a grim purpose, their bodies low and lean in the saddles. Not saviors, hunters. Eleanor instinctively stepped back, clutching the baby tighter. The desert offered no sanctuary. She was exposed in a sea of sand and scrub. As they approached, the men fanned out, a practiced, predatory maneuver that tightened a noose of dust and dread around her. Their leader reined in his horse directly in front of her, the beast snorting and stamping, sensing the tension. He was a tall man, and his eyes, the only part of his face visible above a grimy bandana, were chips of cold obsidian. They swept over her, dismissed her, then settled on the bundle in her arms. A flicker of something, not surprise, but a grim satisfaction passed through them. He dismounted slowly, each movement deliberate, his eyes never leaving her. Eleanor backed away, but it was too late. The other two riders had positioned themselves to cut off any escape. The baby stirred weakly, a soft moan escaping its chapped lips. The leader took a step forward, his boots thick with dust. His voice, when it came, was as dry as the land beneath their feet. "Well now," he said, his tone devoid of warmth. "Looks like we finally found what we came for." The world exploded in a crack of sound so sharp it felt like the sky itself had split open. A geyser of sand erupted at the leader's feet, causing his horse to rear in panic. In an instant, all three men had drawn their weapons, the cold blue steel of their guns sweeping the wasteland, searching for the threat. And then they saw it. On a rocky outcrop 50 yards away, a figure had risen. A woman, her silhouette stark against the unforgiving blue of the sky, a long rifle held steady in her hands. Her dress was tattered, a flag of a life left behind, her hair a tangled mess in the wind. "Get away from them," her voice carried across the distance, thin but wiry, like tempered steel. The leader, after a moment of shock, turned toward the outcrop. He showed no fear. Instead, a low, gravelly chuckle rumbled in his chest. The sound held no humor, only the grating satisfaction of a long hunt nearing its end. "Leah, I'll be damned," he muttered, loud enough for Eleanor to hear. "We were wondering when you'd show your face." So this was the woman they were after, but this was not the face of a kidnapper. This was the face of a cornered she-wolf, her eyes burning with a wild, desperate fire. "That's my daughter," Leah shouted, the rifle still aimed at the leader's chest. "She needs help. Your daughter?" The leader spat on the ground. "You mean the daughter you stole from her father? The one you left for dead while you ran off with? His money? I didn't leave her." Leah's voice cracked, the steel resolve showing its first fracture. I hid her. To draw you curs away." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of despair. This wasn't a rescue. It was a battle for ownership, and she and the baby were caught in the crossfire. She looked down at the tiny face in her arms. The baby's skin seemed to have taken on a grayish tint, and a faint, shuddering sigh escaped its lips, a sound so fragile it threatened to be her last. "She's fading." Eleanor's own voice was a parched whisper, directed at the woman with the rifle. "Whatever this is, it can wait. She can't." For a moment, silence fell again, broken only by the whistling wind. Leah's eyes left the leader and locked onto the bundle in Eleanor's arms. Raw horror and pain were stark on her face. The leader seemed not to care. He just shrugged. "That ain't my concern," he snarled, his own gun still casually aimed in Leah's direction. "Mr. Thorne wants his property back, and he ain't known for his patience." The leader's lips curled into something that wasn't a smile. It was distilled contempt. "Property?" he repeated, savoring the word. "You don't even know the half of it, do you, Leah? You want to tell her the whole story, or should I?" He didn't wait for an answer. His cruel gaze fixed on Leah, who trembled on her rocky perch. "Let's talk about the one you didn't bring with you." The words hung in the dry air, venomous as a rattlesnake's bite. Eleanor felt the blood run cold in her veins. Leah let out a choked sob, a sound of weak protest. "Don't," she whispered. "Mr. Thorne didn't have one daughter," the leader continued, his voice cruelly conversational, as if reading from a ledger. "He had two, twins. Tell them about the fire, Leah. Tell them about the choice you had to make, how you could only carry one, how you took this one." He gestured with his chin toward the bundle in Eleanor's arms. And left her sister too. The smoke and the flames. The rifle slipped from Leah's grasp, clattering onto the rocks with a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. She crumpled, not like a person, but like a building imploding, folding in on a foundation of pure agony. Her sobs were no longer the cries of defiance, but the broken whimpers of a shattered soul. Eleanor looked down at the child in her arms. The baby suddenly felt immensely heavy, weighted not by flesh and bone, but by the ghost of a lost sister and the tragedy of an unimaginable choice. "You think this is about a broken heart?" Jed sneered, now turning his attention to Eleanor. "You think Mr. Thorne is a grieving father who wants his baby back?" He let out a short, ugly laugh. "Mr. Thorne ain't grieving. He's balancing a ledger." Eleanor stared at him, uncomprehending. "This child," Jed said, his voice cold as steel, "ain't a daughter to him. She's collateral. She's the payment for a debt. To some very serious men from back east. A commodity to be sold to the highest bidder. If the desert could freeze, it would have in that moment." Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. She saw the younger rider, the one who had remained silent, flinch as if struck. His tanned, youthful face had gone slack with disbelief. "Selling a child?" The young rider, Cody, stammered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "That ain't what we signed on for." "You'll do what you're paid to do." Yet's voice was flat and final, like dirt on a coffin lid. His eyes swept over Cody, then to the sobbing Leah, and finally rested on Eleanor and the precious bundle she held. "Now get the ropes." As Cody moved to get the ropes, something shifted in Eleanor Vance. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a tectonic realignment of her soul. The grief was still there, a permanent scar, but the numbness was gone, burned away by a cold, pure, righteous fury. She rose to her feet, not with the weakness of a woman who had come here to die, but with the unyielding straightness of an old ironwood tree that had endured a century of storms. "Stop," she said. The voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that made all three men pause. Jed turned, a contemptuous sneer on his lips. "What did you say, old woman?" "None of you are taking this child anywhere," Eleanor said, her voice terrifyingly calm. She looked at each of them in turn, and her gaze was no longer that of a victim, but of a judge. She looked at Leah, crumpled on the rocks. "You faced a choice no mother should ever face. You saved a life. That is not a sin. That is a miracle." Her gaze found Cody, who stood frozen, his face a canvas of conflict. "You have a choice right now. To be the man who follows orders or the man who draws a line." Finally she looked at Jed, and in her eyes he saw no fear, only an emptiness, more frightening than death. "And you," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous calm, "you've mistaken a ledger for a soul. This child is not a debt to be paid." Cody's hand, which had been hovering near his gun belt, dropped to his side. He shook his head, a slow, final movement. "No," he said, the word clear and solid. "I'm done. I won't be a party to this." Jed spun on him, his face a mask of fury. "You'll die right here, boy." But as he moved for his gun, Cody lunged, not like a trained fighter, but with the raw strength of rebellion. They hit the ground in a tangle of limbs and curses. The heavy Colt revolver spun out of Yet's holster, landing in the dust just feet from Eleanor. She did not run. She did not flinch. While the two men wrestled, she looked forward, knelt, and her hand closed around the checkered grip of the gun. The weight felt strange, but necessary. Jed threw Cody aside and scrambled to his feet, freezing when he found himself staring down the barrel of his own gun. "That's enough," Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the desert air with the authority of a judge's gavel. She stood there, a lone figure amidst the chaos, holding justice in her hand. And for the first time in months, she was in control. Silence fell over the land, broken only by the wind and the ragged breathing of the two men who had been fighting. The gun in Eleanor's hand did not waver. She had already walked through the door of fear and found nothing left on the other side. To lose. Her voice remained steady, a low anchor in the swirling dust. "Leah," she said, not taking her eyes off Jed. "You will take a horse. You will ride east and not look back." It was not a suggestion. It was a verdict. Leah stumbled to her feet, her tear-streaked face a map of sorrow. She approached, not to claim her child, but to see her one last time. A trembling hand reached out, brushing the baby's fevered brow, a wordless goodbye that held a world of pain and love. Her eyes met Eleanor's, and in them was not just gratitude, but a transference. "Protect her." Without another word, she turned. Cody, the young rider, had quietly brought a horse for her. Leah climbed into the saddle and became a dwindling silhouette against the bleeding horizon. She did not look back. Eleanor waited until Leah's figure was a mere speck before she turned her attention back to the two remaining men. Jed stared at her, his face a mask of thwarted rage. "You think this is the end of it?" he spat. "Thorn will send others." Eleanor didn't flinch. "Then let them come," she said, her voice as quiet as the coming dusk. "They will find nothing here but ghosts." She had been one herself after all. She knew how to disappear. She gestured with the gun barrel toward their remaining horse. "Go." Cody helped Jed to his feet, and without a word, they mounted and rode west, leaving Eleanor alone with the child and the enveloping silence of the desert. When the last of the hoofbeats had faded, Eleanor finally lowered the gun. She stood for a long time, feeling the warmth of the baby against her chest. The sun sank behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in streaks of violet and gold, a benediction on the harsh land. The desert was no longer her enemy. It was the place where she had died and the place where she had been reborn. She looked down at the small face sleeping in her arms, its breathing now deeper and more even. "Grace," she whispered to the darkening sky. "Your name is Grace, because that's what you are. An impossible grace found in a godless place." Together they faced the coming night. Eleanor Vance never returned to the life she had known. She and the child, Grace, vanished into the vastness of the west, two specks of dust carried on the wind. They found a small valley town in Colorado, a place where the past was a story you chose to tell, not one that hunted you down. There, among the tall aspens and clear-running streams, Grace grew up, knowing nothing but the love of a mother who had walked through hell and found heaven in her arms. Years later, under the shade of a whispering aspen grove, Eleanor told Grace the story of fire and sand, of a mother's impossible choice and a stranger's second chance. And Grace, with a wisdom beyond her years, understood. Of Leah, nothing was ever heard again. Some say the desert that had been her crucible became her sanctuary, and she found peace under a different name in a town far to the south. Others whisper that she was a spirit of the wasteland herself, a fleeting ghost of maternal love who returned to the dust once her child was safe. Eleanor always believed the former and Mr. Thorne, the man who would have sold his own blood for silver. Word came down the trail a year later that his creditors from the east had finally come to collect. His name was simply added to the long list of men who learned too late that some debts can only be paid in full. The West is a hard land. It has its own unforgiving ledger. Grace grew into a woman who understood a profound truth, that some bonds are not forged in the womb, but in the crucible of a shared journey. That a family is not merely the blood you are born with, but the hands you reach for in the darkness.